Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review the original Robocop film, of course, done in 1987. Really, I was kind of fascinated by this movie because when actually going into it, it kind of almost breaks down almost like a horror film. If you honestly edit it a little bit, you can almost see that this movie could honestly be done as a horror film that could scare people if edited the right way. You could have it to where RoboCop is actually a villainous person that ends up beating up people, and this could actually be a horror film where RoboCop is actually a bad guy, to where we end up not really quite understanding the whole aspect of RoboCop actually being the hero of this story, which I honestly think is kind of fascinating if we could actually have a RoboCop story where he actually is a villain or becomes a villain. Um, that's what I kind of would think would be a fascinating, if you're gonna go and do Brightburn where Superman becomes evil. What if they did a kind of RoboCop movie where RoboCop is a villain? Not call it RoboCop, of course. Call it something completely different, but make it feel like that and have it be a villain story. Because really, in all honesty, I would think that idea would be pretty cool. But some people might feel differently because they're tied to RoboCop and they're tied to this franchise and story and whatever. I'm saying it won't be actually RoboCop being a villain or misunderstood or whatever. I just think that reasonably it would just be interesting to see a robot character that feels like a RoboCop story but eventually turns evil. That'd be kind of cool, right? Maybe? No? Going into this film, I really do enjoy the Omnicorp company desperately trying to come up with some kind of new gimmick to sell to the military or to the police force to desperately try to get more money into this company. And so, of course, you end up having some attempts, some tries to figure out how to put their best foot forward with this company to try to have something work out. It is kind of funny how we really completely take the human element out of RoboCop for a bulk of this movie. Even to the point where it never really seems like we actually have any emotional things going on with RoboCop at all in this movie. To where if you watch the RoboCop of 2014, you end up having a RoboCop for the most of that movie is a very hard on his sleeve kind of guy. Where in this film you have a completely emotionless RoboCop, to where eventually he is to eventually be into the action and starting to be angry, upset, and whatever about what has gone on. But you have this RoboCop kind of having much more of a learning block situation where he's trying to find his humanity, which I do actually enjoy. Going into this movie, I do very much like the origin of this story, much more so than the 2014 thing. Where in the 2014 movie, you just have car bomb, and that kind of sucked. Whereas in this movie, you can really invest in Alex Murphy and why he has to go back and go after these guys to get even with them. To me, RoboCop honestly does a lot remind me of The Crow, with the exclusion of this guy is just a person that is completely stripped away from everything that was him before. Where The Crow does have have a lot of himself left. He's just a completely and totally immortal-ish person that is to do whatever he can to seek revenge with the power of the Crow. Not a gun-toting gunslinger-ish guy. We really have this movie actually also feeling like I kind of was just going with, this movie is a kind of modern-day Western, which I actually was you know what, I love the fact that this movie is a Western. Like, very few movies do have that Western kind of feel anymore. And that's the thing that I do actually enjoy about this movie most, is when really looking at it. With the Robocop themed delivery and the base of the way that Robocop's to fling his gun around, it's a Western movie in modern day, which I do really thoroughly enjoy. Uh, I honestly thought it was always kind of goofy, though, that we end up having Robocop who is forcibly in some cop car. I get the imagery of Robocop getting out of a cop car and people being like completely and utterly like frightened by that. Like it creates like a hidden visual that appears out of somewhere and then people are freaking out about that. I get that, but I just think it's like, man, that must have been a pain in the butt for Weller to try and get into a vehicle or car or whatever, and like try to, not only that, but how many numerous times like painstakingly like he would have like a lot of problems getting used to this kind of suit. I had heard a interview with Weller talking about him having to put on this suit. Supposedly, the suit ended up taking 9 hours to put together. It seems that Weller, I guess, was also very claustrophobic. I guess, while actually putting on the suit as well. It seemed that Weller would go, and while everybody would go out and party and do whatever, like we had Peter who ended up kind of just going and kind of zenning out while they were to take 9 hours to put his suit on. Like everybody would go on break and whatever while putting on Peter Weller's suit, and Peter would just be like zenning out. She'd be like, "Well, I can't. Like there is no on and off switch with me having the suit on." So yeah, it took RoboCop 9 hours to put on this suit. Isn't that fascinating? Um, like man, that's an entire day for some people. Uh, Hence why I can kind of figure within this movie how they tried to skirt around some of RoboCop's story, where they had some people really kind of carrying the story, whether it be the people of Omnicorp uh, or Murphy's partner Lewis, or like I can kind of see how it's like, okay, like this was kind of smart the way that they shot this movie. Like they injected some news reports, they injected bizarrely commercials in this movie, like bizarrish like mock commercials that they came up together, like the commercials Nukem, which I thought was funny. It was kind of like Battleship, but it was like a rip off of that, which I thought was funny. Going into this movie, we also consistently have some comedic character that is consistently mentioning, "I wouldn't buy that for $1," and ha ha ha, everyone's laughing and everyone's giggling and whatever. And really, I thought it was funny how like we have it to where a lot of the RoboCop 2014 movie, because I keep having to make comparisons of both now that I've seen both of them fairly recently. I like the fact that the 2014 movie honors this original film, and I really do enjoy that, even though obviously the suit of this was way more complicated than the one that was done in 2014. Even the actor who had done the 2014 version had said like, "Yeah, man, like this suit was complicated, but nowhere close as complicated as Peter Weller was. His suit that took numerous hours." Like, good God, to hear the horror stories of Peter Weller of this suit and how complicated it was and whatever, like would be just so fascinating and so interesting to just kind of see his stories. So with that said, I took about 10 minutes to talk about this, but man, is this movie, it's really just fun. To me, like I'm kind of giving and taking really with this movie, to just be like, well, like, was it really that good? Was it good? Like, to me, like, there wasn't any, like, I think, real true downside to this film, I think. There wasn't anything that I want to nitpick about or just tear it down or whatever. Like, I think overall, this is just a fun, solid movie. I kind of like the fact that we end up also having quite a bit of times where you're seeing through RoboCop's point of view rather than actually seeing RoboCop see things, which I think is actually very fun in this movie. Because really, we very seldomly see things in a person's point of view as if we're actually seeing through their eyes. Very rarely do we get that now because, of course, everybody just wants just showcase the actual actor, the person, or whatever. There's some movies where like they kind of have to do that to do a nod to something. Like in the Dwayne the Rock Johnson movie Doom, they go into the uh, like the person eyes because it's trying to be just like the Doom game, which I could applaud them for, which I actually thought was kind of cool. So I think it's about that time to bust out the spoilers of this movie. I am kind of I am kind of a little concerned about me going through the spoilers of this film. Even though a lot of people would say, "Oh no, it's really easy." Like I don't know if I'm gonna get everything right. I think I'm probably gonna stumble and fumble on a lot of things. So get ready for that. But I am also gonna try as much as possible to have fun talking about the spoiler version of this movie because really there is some like I like robot stuff. Like if anybody like I've reviewed Terminator and I just like fell back in love with it because I'm like, yeah, like this is actually a really good like this is like robot movies. Who would have thought I would have liked those? Um, like who would have thought I liked robot films? Because like for me, I always liked like monster films or like supernatural. But I'm starting to really enjoy robot movies. Bizarrely, I don't know why. But anyways, I think it's about that time to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. So in the very beginning of this, we end up having uh, Omnicorp trying to come up with the next robot or the next invention to try to market. And so we immediately have a guy named Dick Jones who is pitching this giant robot named Ed 209. So we end up having Ed 209 who is to go and do a presentation. So we end up having Ed 209 who is present at this location. We end up having Dick Jones who ends up giving some guy a gun and tells the guy to hold up the gun in a threatening manner. The guy does so, and so we end up having Ed 209 telling this guy with the gun to put the gun down. And so we end up immediately having this guy doing so, and we end up having Ed 209 who is still telling the guy to put down the gun in a matter of countdown. And so we end up having all of a sudden this guy going like, "Oh crap! Like this thing is malfunctioning. Oh crap!" So the funny thing is they don't start to turn this thing off. They don't hit a switch. They don't whatever. They just let this thing roll. So this thing is counting down, and so we all of a sudden have this guy who's all of a sudden scrambling, like having like throwing people in front of him, whatever. But eventually this guy is trying to just like run away, run off from this thing. And we immediately have it to where Ed 209 shoots him up, kills him, murders this guy right in front of our eyes. So we immediately have it to where Dick Jones' idea just goes up in smoke. So we immediately have it to where Morton is to throw his pitch out there of a robot slash human in a suit. So we really have it to where some guy is going to Mortman and is like, "Well, do you really think that this like RoboCop thing is going to work? And do you really think that you'll have a candidate for this RoboCop?" And we have it to where Morton is like, well, yeah, like pray for the poor soul who has to be this RoboCop guy. So we go on and we end up have we end up have we have Alex Murphy, who is the new kid in this police department, and so we end up having Murphy ushered into this Detroit police department where he is to be partnered up with a girl named Lewis. So we have both Murphy and Lewis being tagged together, and so we end up having Murphy, who is consistently taking his gun out and flinging the gun repetitiously to where Murphy mentions to Lewis, it's like, well, yeah, like I tend to just kind of take out my gun and kind of fling it around because my son really loves that I do that. My son uh, loves old westerns and really he wanted me to do some kind of funny thing with a gun to where I can do it kind of like the old west style. Like it's for my kid, like it's to kind of show him that I'm like a cowboy just like he loves. So we end up having it to where we have uh, seemingly both Murphy and Lewis that is going through a normal call, and so we end up having Murphy and Lewis, I think, trying to call for backup, but nobody comes, and so we end up having Murphy and Lewis, who ends up just going in anyways, and so we end up having seemingly Murphy and Lewis both going in. We end up having Lewis, who is to stop one guy, and while he's taking a leak, and we end up having this one guy telling Lewis, like, well, like, could you excuse me while I zip this up or whip this out or whatever. So we eventually have it to where this guy ends up going and hitting Lewis, knocking her out. And eventually we end up having Murphy, who ends up going further along into this warehouse. Because I think Lewis and Murphy, I think, eventually get separated. That's why they're not at that same place where Lewis is dealing with that guy. So we eventually have Murphy, who is to make his way through this warehouse. And so we eventually have Murphy, who is quickly but surely getting outnumbered. We end up having guys who are named Leon, Emmett, and Clarence, and some other guys that are Johnson. Some other guys that are surrounding Murphy. And so we end up eventually having Clarence, who is to knock Murphy down, and eventually we have it to where Clarence is to mention to Murphy how, for some reason, he hates cops and cops hate him. So we end up having it to where eventually Clarence decides to go and start to play with Murphy, kind of like do his gun in some kind of motion to make Murphy not exactly know where he is going to get shot first. And Clarence ends up shooting Murphy into the hand to where Murphy's like, ah! And so we eventually have it to where the guy who had knocked Lewis down had come back to just say like, hey man, like I met this guy's partner, man was she hot and whatever. It's like, oh well, that's great. So we eventually have it to where Murphy is now like holding on to his hand, of course, and so eventually we end up having just all of the thugs lining up to take their shots at Murphy, repetitiously just firing into him one by one to eventually kill him off. So we eventually have, of course, every single one of these people who are to basically just get away with this. So we end up having it to where we have a viewpoint that consistently appears, to where it seems like a large amount of time has passed from screen on to screen off. It seems that we end up having Mortman, who is showcasing exactly how Robocop is to eventually be put together, showcasing like a very strong arm that Robocop is to have, or it seems to have like 400 pounds of foot pressure or something. And so we eventually have it to where at some point they're celebrating New Year's, and so we end up having one person like putting a hat on Robocop and kissing him on the lips. And so we end up having it to where eventually uh, Robocop is to finally be put together and to finally be put out onto the force, and it seems that this RoboCop is working perfectly fine, and we end up having eventually Mortman eventually going to the police department asking for RoboCop to get a car and all that jazz. So we go on and we have it to where Mortman is just so happy about this RoboCop invention. Like he is so like man, like this is gonna be the best thing that we ever do, and blah 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 blah. Like Mormon is so confident that he's boasting to his coworkers about how like great this is gonna be and how like brilliant that he is for coming up with this. To where eventually when Mortman is in the restroom of this company, we end up having him also just kind of throw his boss under the bus, saying that Dick Jones is like is just like the worst thing for this company. Ba 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 ba. Bunch of like a bunch of crappy or shady remarks. To where we end up finding out a bunch of people scrambling bizarrely from out of this bathroom to eventually showcase that Dick Jones was actually in this bathroom hearing what Morton was talking about him. And so Dick Jones would mention it's like, well, hey, like, you know what? There had been times where I had talked about the old man, which is like the owner of this company, called the Old Man. Bizarrely, he doesn't have an actual real name for this movie, but he's just called the Old Man. We have Dick Jones who mentions that at some points and sometimes he would call his boss a number of things. He would call him an a-hole and all kinds of other stuff. Uh, but Dick Jones is telling Morton how that eventually the RoboCop thing is going to fail and blow up in his face, and that eventually Mormon needs to also realize that Dick is number two in this company and he will always stay that way. So, like, it's kind of a really interesting, like, kind of thing going on between both Dick Jones and Mortman. Like, these two are really, like, the best people to have in this situation because they're really good at what they do, which is kind of being the uh, kind of like the a-hole people, to where they're just kind of like they could be really nice, but then they can also be very vicious. And that's the thing that I like about this movie is like they perfectly casted some like a lot of like they did a really great amount of casting within this movie. So we go on to have RoboCop eventually go on and do some uh go on to do some like jobs here and there, take out some thugs. We end up having Robocop to eventually come out of his car and eventually take down two guys that are uh, tearing a woman's clothes to uh, trying to uh, forcibly sex a woman. Anyways, we have it to where Robocop ends up going out and shooting through this woman's dress to nail this guy in the Johnson in the D, and we end up having also RoboCop going and just taking down both of these guys, and we end up having a woman who is like, "Oh my God, thank you, sir," and we end up having RoboCop going like, "Well, like I will notify that you have been RAPE, uh, and so I will let a counselor know that that has happened to you, and you'll go and seek the help that you need." There's some words that I try to spell out because reasonably I either don't want to say them or reasonably I would like if I say the words, more than likely there might be some kind of YouTube thing that this video gets counted against me or some garbage. It's better just to spell a word out so I don't have to worry about something. So eventually we end up having like RoboCop just doing a bang up job. To where eventually we end up having him go into this like uh, this this place where all the cops are all like shooting their guns. And so we end up having all the cops just kind of like shooting out their guns to all like test out their guns or whatever. We end up having RoboCop who is basically just annihilating this paper with targets on it, just annihilating it, and then just flings his gun back into his holster. So we eventually have it to where RoboCop is taking down some thugs and whatever, kind of doing some common crime esh like things, and then eventually we end up having it to where Mortman is going to get his just desserts. Mortman is to uh, be at home where he is sniffing drugs off of some girl's chest. And we end up having to where Clarence is to arrive at this guy's house to uh, put to shoot him repetitiously in the leg, and then eventually we end up having Clarence, who is to show a tape of Dick Jones uh, telling Mortman that he's basically out, and all kinds of other things. So we end up having Clarence, who ends up taking a grenade and unsheathing it with his teeth, and we end up having Clarence leaving this home, and immediately once he does that, we end up having Mortman's home blow up. Because Clarence can't, of course, get to this grenade because his legs don't work. So, we, pushing on. If we can. If we can push on. Okay. So, we eventually have it to where RoboCop, we end up finding out that RoboCop is evidently a person who can eat food, but it comes out to be some kind of like bizarre-ish looking baby food, which I thought was kind of interesting. But anyways, we end up having RoboCop eventually going and he is just kind of sitting uh, in this one room, and things are starting, like memories are starting to come back to him, because we end up having it to where eventually when RoboCop is trying to go back to his reserved room one day, we end up having Lewis, who ends up asking what RoboCop's name is, and we end up having Lewis, who reminds RoboCop that his real name is Murphy. Your name is Murphy. And so Immediately once that pops into Robocop's head, we have him start to all of a sudden start to remember things. Uh, we end up having eventually also, before Morton is to eventually get killed, we end up having Mortman talk to Lewis about what she had tried to do, was to try to make Robocop remember. And really, Mortman has to remind them and remind her, like, hey, this guy doesn't have a memory, he has a program. Like, do not F with that. So, we end up having it to where we have Robocop who is to eventually start remembering things and eventually start to uh, go on to remember his death. And we end up having Robocop who ends up going on to eventually start to find some people who are tied to his death. So we end up having at first, we end up having RoboCop who ends up finding, uh, Emil or Emil, the guy who ends up getting doused in the vat of toxic waste. That guy. So we end up having RoboCop who ends up going and seeing Emmett, who is to, I think, try and rob a gas station. I believe. I know that there's a gas station related to this. So we end up having eventually RoboCop stopping Emil at this location, and we end up having Emil, who remembers RoboCop, is like, dude, like, I remember you. Like, we killed you. You're dead. And so we end up having it to where uh, really eventually Emil ends up escaping after this, to where eventually we have to have him like towards the end of the movie, because no matter who RoboCop eventually like starts to grab and get and whatever, for all these villains, eventually they skate away. We also eventually have it to where RoboCop is to eventually remember Emil, and he is to put this guy's information into a computer, and then also look at people that are allied or allianced with him, known affiliations that this guy has been with, which we end up finding every single person that had killed Murphy. And so eventually we end up having also the one of the convictions that these people are quite possibly tied to is the murder of Murphy. And so we eventually have it to where uh, Murphy eventually, or RoboCop eventually, like gets the information of Murphy, and it shows that he's deceased. So we end up having we end up having RoboCop who eventually goes and tries to find Leon in some nightclub, and eventually pulls his hair and tries to get him to be arrested. Uh, if anything, I think the best line in the whole RoboCop series is "Dead or alive, you're coming with me." That has got to be the coolest line delivery. But yeah, if anything, I'm going to kind of skirt through any of really RoboCop getting any number of these people, because I just like let's quickly like go through any of that because it doesn't really matter. So, because they all live until the very end, anyways, it doesn't matter. It's kind of just a moot point to get more footage out. So we have it to where RoboCop is to eventually start to remember his family. We end up having it to where RoboCop is trying to remember what had happened with his family, and he is told that his family uh, had left town, because immediately when Murphy had died, they decided to move away because Murphy is dead. So we end up having Murphy re-find his home, and kind of find some things that are very familiar to him within his home, to see his kid kind of playing, his wife telling him that he loves him, and eventually he ends up finding some photo that reminds them of some Halloween. So we have it to where Robocop is starting to, of course, remember things. So we go on, uh, hopefully. So we eventually have it to where Robocop is to eventually find where Clarence is. And so Robocop's purpose is to go after Clarence. And so we end up having Robocop who ends up killing everybody that is connected to Clarence within this warehouse that he is in to save Clarence for last. So we end up having Robocop grabbing Clarence, and the most interesting thing about this movie is when Clarence is consistently going through all these things of glass repetitiously. There's got to be like three or four like things of glass that Clarence goes through here, which I thought was crazy. I'm like, good God, that has got to be like so freaking dangerous. So we have it to where Clarence is confessing that RoboCop should not go after Clarence because he's protected. He works with Dick Jones, and that guy is the owner of or is the number two guy of the OCP. So reasonably, RoboCop should not go after Clarence and should not try to kill him because he knows Dick Jones. And so we have it to where forcibly RoboCop wants to kill Clarence, but he has orders. He has objectives. And so we end up having RoboCop who has to be forced to arrest this guy instead. So we end up having Clarence who ends up getting arrested, and so we end up having, of course, Clarence who is to call Dick Jones, and Dick Jones is like, "Oh my God, like you made a huge mistake. You really effed up here." So by having Clarence like mention Dick Jones and whatever, so we end up having to where Clarence is quite easily released because of like Dick Jones being able to get him out. So we end up having it eventually where RoboCop is to go after Dick Jones and to go on to like have a video like showcasing that that Dick Jones uh, was tied to basically Murphy's murder and everything because really Clarence had funded everything. So we ended up having it to where since Morton is dead, Dick Jones kind of does have control over RoboCop right now. So we end up having it to where Dick Jones had put in a directive where RoboCop cannot arrest anybody that is of OCP. And so, whereas the remake movie, they go into the whole red asset thing where RoboCop can't kill a red asset, where in this movie we end up just having Dick Jones putting in a directive that RoboCop cannot actually arrest anybody from the OCP, which is kind of a crappy directive, but it is what it is. So we end up having RoboCop struggling to want to arrest Dick Jones, but can't. So he kind of has this like bizarrish, weird mumbo jumbo like way to where eventually like RoboCop just gets turned off. So we end up having it uh to where since that happened, we end up having RoboCop who ends up wanting to just go off on his own, because if he can't arrest somebody who is as crooked as Dick Jones, then like really RoboCop no longer wants to be controlled. So we end up having RoboCop who is to go off with Lewis. And so we have Lewis who ends up giving RoboCop some tools and stuff like that. We end up having RoboCop who ends up taking off his visor, and we end up having also RoboCop trying to adjust his targeting meter so that way he can figure out exactly where to shoot. So moving on. So we end up having RoboCop basically fixing himself so that way he cannot be controlled. And so we eventually have it to where we have RoboCop who ends up going off to go and take care of all these guys, to go and arrest them or kill them or whatever he wants to do, because he should have the free will of choice, because he is a human at this point now. He's mostly more human than machine. So we have it to where Clarence and all of his men get a weapons upgrade, because we have it to where Dick Jones is giving Clarence like basically military funding weaponry, because basically for the OCP they basically are the military. So we end up having Clarence and his gang getting an upgrade of weaponry to where they are to test it out and showcase how powerful it is. Ba 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 ba. So we go on and we have it to where did I no, I think that happens later. Because I was thinking, like, did RoboCop fight Ed 209? No, I don't think that happens. I think that happens later, where RoboCop just goes and basically just blows away Ed 209. I think that's what ends up happening. He could have fought him off before, but no. So going on here, we end up having RoboCop who is to try and seek out, of course, Clarence and his men. So we eventually have it to where one by one, RoboCop, with the help of Lewis, is to one by one eventually find these men and eventually take them out. We end up having RoboCop who ends up going and God, how exactly does this go? We end up, I think, having Emil who ends up getting into a car, and I'm trying to figure out how exactly this ends, because I'm like, well, I think Lewis does take out. I think Lewis does take out Leon, because he ends up kind of firing his weapon, but eventually Lewis, I think, ends up taking him out. We end up having Mel who ends up going and crashing into a thing of toxic waste, which turns him into a mutant, which has him just kind of walking around like begging people to help him, but they don't know how because bad of toxic waste. So we end up having it to where eventually, Lewis does take Leon out, but that happens like way towards the end, because we eventually have it to where Lewis ends up going and finding one of the villain's guns, shooting Lewis, who is in this crane operating thing, and so we'll get to that. So we end up having it to where RoboCop is taking out all these villains. And so we end up having RoboCop who is to eventually try and get Clarence. And we end up having Leon who ends up dropping this crane full of these metal pieces, these metal parts. And we end up having Robocop who is to go on and try to uh, still have to take down Clarence with still being buried under all this metal rubble. We end up having Lewis, who ends up firing onto Leon, which kills him off. And so we end up having Robocop, who is now fighting with uh, Clarence, because Clarence is trying to have a like metal, like a spike of sorts, a metal spike to try and jab, or metal spear to jab into Robocop. He ends up stabbing him in the heart, and then we end up eventually having Robocop pulling that out, and then eventually we end up having when uh, Clarence goes to stab Robocop in the heart, we end up having Robocop who ends up taking uh, his metal knife thing and stabbing Clarence into the neck, which ends up killing him off. It's kind of interesting how, like, I don't think in the remake, I don't think that they had that like knife piece that came out. Um, I could be wrong, but like I don't remember that ever being an actual part in the movie in the remake. But if it is, then I would be happy to be wrong. I just don't. I did just. Bleh, I just didn't see it used in the remake, and so really, I was like, you know what? Like, I think that whole like knife like thing was probably the coolest part about RoboCop, especially the original one, where eventually you could just see RoboCop use that knife every once in a while, that knife little part. A lot of the times, the knife thing would be coming as a little assist like device thing for him to just jab into somewhere where he can get some information. But so going into here, so we still have to get rid of one more person. We still have to take down one more person. And so we end up having Robocop, who is to make his way back to the OCP. And so we end up having Ed 209, who is just waiting around the building because evidently all the police officers are right now all on strike. So we end up having Dick Jones just saying how wonderful like the Ed 209 thing is, and that maybe they're going to make more of them to police the streets. And so we have him there in this like boards meeting with all like the high executives, the old man, and all kinds of other high executives talking about like what they're going to do next. And so we end up having RoboCop, who ends up going and appearing and immediately taking one of the villain's guns that he had, and he ends up going and shooting a gun into Ed 209, which clearly just destroys this thing. So we have RoboCop, who makes his way into the this conference room where Dick Jones is, to where we end up having RoboCop play a video for everybody of evidence that Dick Jones had killed Morton and like had been tied with Clarence and all kinds of things to make Dick Jones a villainous person. So we end up having immediately where Dick Jones is to grab onto the old man and hold him hostage and be like, dude, I want a helicopter here, like I want it now, and so on and so forth. And we end up having the old man firing Dick Jones, and RoboCop was like, thank you, because we immediately have it to where RoboCop realizes that the directive is now clear because Dick Jones no longer works for the OCP. So we end up having RoboCop, who ends up firing onto Dick Jones and have him go flying out this window to fall down this building and to die. So we end up having RoboCop killing everybody that was otherwise tied to his murder, and so justice has been served. I think everything has been covered for the most point of this review. I didn't go over the commercials. I didn't go over the news stuff because really, like, it isn't a vitally important part of this movie. It's just kind of fun to see these bizarrish commercials that arrive. Like, I think I remember, like, there was one doctor commercial where they were to basically showcase that, like, hey guys, if you want another heart, Like, go ahead and get one, another pacemaker, metal heart, whatever, because we care. Hmm. And then the doctor ends believing. But I think other than that, I think there wasn't very much a huge amount of commercials here. But I think I kind of did cover everything, I hope. So if I didn't, let me know in the comments below what I didn't cover. Really, I might have mixed up anything within this movie, and I do apologize. But really, I was also just kind of really just like thinking like, oh my god, I'm gonna have issues reviewing this movie. Like I didn't realize like how like I also just reviewed like Fantastic Four 2005, and with all the stuff that was going on there, like I had easy even keel way about reviewing that. Where this one I was like, oh my god, there's so much to talk about. There's so much to unpack within this movie, and more than likely I will be mortified after the fact because I know I'll probably rewatch this movie at some point again and then realize, oh my god, this is the one thing that I didn't mention in my review because I feel like that will happen somewhere. Or I'll get details that weren't exactly correct or whatever, but it is what it is. Eventually, I'll probably review this again, maybe at some point in time, just correcting things, or if I made too horrible of a step somewhere, that'll happen. But I enjoy this movie and hopefully you enjoyed it as well, especially this review for how long it is. So I am going to get out of here. Yeah, really bizarrely starting to enjoy robot films, and I never thought I would, just because. But technically, this is technically a robot slash human story, but still, like I guess eventually I'll start like reviewing other robot films. I also found that it seems that RoboCop was fairly interesting to people, and that is great. So I guess eventually there are some other RoboCop things to get into. Bizarrely, I found out like there's like this movie franchise, of course, but then there's also like a RoboCop, like the animated series. Like there's a bunch of those. There's an actual live action RoboCop series which I found out about. There is also a RoboCop movie called RoboCop Prime Directive or Prime Detective or something, which I was like, man, that's weird. Like, okay, like I think I had seen that somewhere at some point in time that movie on TV somewhere, but I didn't understand what exactly that was. So evidently there's just a ton of RoboCop stuff out there. I did, I think, at one point in time see one episode of like the RoboCop like series, but I think that was an episode that wasn't all that good to me, to where I just didn't care about the series overall. So with that said, if you guys want me to cover any of that, because especially if you watch this entire thing, which I do appreciate, let me know in the comments below if you want a series or RoboCop thing covered or whatever. But I am going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.